After being deployed to Iraq for about 3 years, I was back home, and getting back to my home country and meeting my friends and family again was all well and good, but soon some issues started showing up. The most important one, the glaring unemployment. I'd found myself jobless when I returned home and without a proper routine, and that was not sitting well with me. I had applied for some jobs here and there, but nothing positive came up. And that's where my old high school buddy James comes in. He was working the graveyard shift in a factory as a guard, and as soon as his workplace had another opening, he asked me to apply there as well. It was a graveyard as well, and not many people were willing to work those hours. But I, being used to working late hours and the difficulties that come with odd jobs, that was not a problem with me at all. So James put in a good word for me, having a military background, and that got me hired for the job. As the job was a night shift, I didn't need to do as much but do the daily patrols on all 7 floors, as well as partner up with James on our last patrol in the boiler room. And why patrol the boiler room together, you ask? Because the boiler room was haunted, apparently. Several years ago, the building was once a brewery company. It was a quite successful venture at that too, that lasted over 15 years. And owing to that success, the owners had amassed some enemies along the way too. And one such enemy was said to have robbed and murdered the owner's son just outside the parking lot of the brewery. The culprit was never found. After losing his son, the owner fell into depression and drowned himself in one of the brewery tanks. That's turned into the boiler room later on. But that's not where the story ends. It was not the only death that happened in the room. Just last year, there was a night shift guard that was mysteriously found dead in the boiler room that very next morning. And that was how the story about the deadly boiler room came to be and became common knowledge. They had a few temporary workers posted there working the night shift, but they all quit after working only a single night. All of them cited the similar reasons: ghostly appearances, whispers, and screams from the boiler room. The last guard that had worked the graveyard said that he heard screaming and banging in the boiler room, so it had been hard for the owner to keep a steady night guard shift since then. But that all changed when James took the job and then brought me along as well. After serving 3 years in Iraq and witnessing many horrors of the war and all, I didn't really believe in all the haunted ghost stories. Neither was I afraid of them because there wasn't much left that could faze me anymore. But still, as a precaution, James warned me not to ever go to the boiler room by myself, and I didn't want to worry him unnecessarily, so I took his advice and we decided to always patrol the boiler room together. I had been going on the job for over a month now and hadn't found anything out of the ordinary happening around yet. No ghostly figures or whispers had halted me in my steps. No haunting spirits had made themselves known to me in the boiler room. I was totally alive and healthy without any frightening presence looming by. So the deadly myth had really just been that, a myth. It was untrue after all. I told as much to James, my partner on rounds, that we must have had broken whatever curse it was on the job. He took that as a relief too. I knew he didn't show it, but he was a little bit scared, owing to the many frightful tales we had heard. So I could tell that going on the job without any disturbances for this long had eased his fears too. But we didn't realize how soon this sense of security of ours was going to be shredded. That fateful night, we had set off for work as usual. James had picked me up on his way, as he sometimes did. We had been planning on going for a fishing trip on our next day off. I had really been looking forward to the trip, thinking it would be a great way to de-stress and relax. James was equally as excited, if not more. So all the way to work, we kept finalizing the details for that. So we were just 2 normal guys going to work on our graveyard shift as we always did. Nothing out of the ordinary there, nothing unusual. What was unusual, however, was the weather that night. It was fine when we had set off, but it had turned stormy on our way there. Sudden dark clouds had made room in the sky, completely hiding the moon behind them. Strong winds had started blowing, and soon the thundering and lightning were added to the chaos. It was quite a sudden change in the weather, so we weren't really prepared for it. So we decided to hurry up before we could get caught in the actual storm that was brewing. We hurried for the factory, not quite running, but close, trying to get in the building before the storm could get worse. The thunder started rumbling in the distance again, making us speed up even more. With another ear-splitting crash of thunder, we stepped into the building, and just as we firmly shut the door behind us, the clouds practically burst into a downpour at once. As we caught our breath and moved on to the cabin to get ready for the job ahead, I could feel that something about the day and the actual air in the building felt off. I couldn't exactly place it, but my sixth sense kept telling me that something was definitely wrong. It was strange and weird, not anything that I had ever felt before. There was a sense of foreboding in the air. All of it was decidedly unsettling. We went on our ways to round all the floors before meeting in front of the boiler room to check that together. That's how it went daily. James and I would take turns patrolling all 7 floors before our shift ended. We would usually make our final patrol in the boiler room before we locked the main vault door at the end of our shift. The previous owner was very private about his secret recipe, so he had the main door replaced with a high-end reinforced vault door. It was a bit paranoid of him, but it served the purpose. It provided excellent security. We didn't have much to worry about after locking the door, assured of the safety it provided. Soon I was finished with my rounds, and it was time for the boiler room check, so I headed towards it. I had reached the boiler room before James, it seemed. He was not standing in front of the door as I reached in, so I decided to just wait for him there. As I was leaning against the wall outside, I unexpectedly felt a chill running down my spine. I stood up straight, suddenly alert, unsure what had tipped me off. And then, along with the chill came the whispers. I shook my head, telling myself that it was just the wind rushing through. "It must be the weather," I mumbled. "Nothing is off. It's all in my head." I was confident. I had no reason not to be. No matter the odds, I was sure everything would be fine. I mean, there was no real danger, and I felt more at ease. Even more sure of myself, as there had never been any obstacles that I was not ready to face, no matter the real things or all this spooky ghost stuff. But with every passing minute, the whispers grew decidedly stronger. So much so that I couldn't blame them on the wind anymore. They actually sounded like someone speaking. I wondered if James was already inside and asking for me. James might be inside. He might be in trouble. I should just check it out. The fighter in me couldn't just stand by anymore, and I had always been a little curious about anything and everything in the world. I'm okay with scary movies anyway, I assured myself. There's nothing to worry about. I'll be fine. And with that, I decided to press on and enter the boiler room anyway, without James beside me. As soon as I entered the room itself felt completely normal. Nothing unusual came into sight, and even no ghostly whispers were in the air anymore. And on first glance, there were also no signs of James around the room. I heaved a heavy sigh of relief, and just when I turned around, deciding to head out and wait for James as I had promised, the lights of the room started rapidly flickering on and off. I looked around in surprise. That had never happened before. Maybe it's the storm messing with the grid system, I reasoned with myself. And then suddenly, the light was completely gone. There was pitch black in the boiler room. I was always anxious. The sudden darkness in the room set me even further on edge. I had never been afraid of darkness, but in that moment, it felt like the scariest thing ever. As my eyes started getting accustomed to the dark, I could feel other presences around me, as if someone was breathing down my back, which was absurd because there was no one else present in the room besides me. But even as I was assuring myself, I could sense that the room itself had started feeling really weird somehow. Even if nothing had looked different a moment ago, the air had turned colder by several degrees suddenly. There was also a new smell in the air. Of what? I was not sure. Death. It reeks of death. I shivered as the sudden thought entered my mind at once. Shaking my head to get rid of the thought, I stumbled around in the room calling James's name. I got no response as earlier. I was starting to get worried about him, but it turned out I should have been more worried about myself. As suddenly as the lights had gone, they came back just as suddenly, and when the lights came back on, I couldn't believe my eyes. What had been just an otherwise empty boiler room had seemingly become completely transformed. Smoke and fog enveloped the floor completely, as if a scene from an actual graveyard from those horror movies. I could feel my heartbeat picking up, so much so that I could hear it in my own ears. The walls around me started shaking and creaking suddenly. I touched a wall to see what was going on, and my hand came back covered in blood. Actual blood, dripping all over the place. I cursed and looked around. It wasn't just the walls. The ceiling and the floor were also all bloody and grimy. In fact, there were already some drops of blood falling on me from the ceiling. And as my mind had earlier provided, it really did smell like death. Decay, to be more precise. There was decaying flesh scattered all over, and then there were bones too. Decidedly human bones. There was a decaying body lying spread eagle in there with its throat ripped apart. It was also in the process of decay, so just chunks of moldy flesh were left on the bones. It was all so horrifying that it made me freeze up instantly. Even the scenes of war were not this bad. All the blood and gore that I was seeing was the stuff of horror stories and movies. It had no business in the real world, but despite that, I was seeing all of it. I could feel my stomach roiling and the bile in my throat. It was too much. And just as I was about to actually throw up, everything was gone in the blink of an eye. I came to my senses so fast it almost gave me whiplash. After getting my senses back, I noticed that James had joined me sometime during the whole spectacle. He seemed to have been in a similar state, frozen in shock and horror right beside the door of the boiler room. The abrupt change of the scenery brought him out of his stupor too. What the hell was that? He turned towards me and asked, eyes wide as saucers. I just... No bloody idea, man, I replied, running a hand over in my hair, still in disbelief over what had just transpired. Let's get the hell out of here before it all... He vaguely gestured around, unable to even finish his words. Yeah, let's. We hurried towards the door to get out of this cursed place, but just as we reached the door, it banged shut. We stumbled back a bit and turned to look towards each other, scared of this new turn of events. We stood there wondering what to do now when suddenly the lights started flickering on and off again. Our horror and fear increased tenfold at once. "To the other door!" I screamed to James. We were both already running towards it before I could even finish my sentence. The previous owner's paranoia had come in handy once again. He had built in a second door to the brewery that no one else was allowed to use except him. It opened directly in his office, but it was going to take us some time to reach the hidden door. As I was running ahead in full speed, dodging the parts of the machinery here and there, I could have sworn I saw a shadowy figure looming around us in the corner of my eye. It seemed to be passing through the huge machinery setups without a pause. I doubled my efforts, which I didn't even know was possible. I hadn't even run that fast during the military days. Adrenaline had flooded my system, and that was all I was running on at the moment. All I could think was, get out, get the hell out, run away, get away from here, run the hell away now! James seemed to be in the same situation. He was shouting beside me incomprehensibly, cursing me probably for my idiocy for coming to the boiler room all by myself. We were both panting, but it still did not slow us down one bit. And then, I made the big mistake of looking back. The bodies that had previously disappeared had reappeared, and what was worse, they weren't lying on the ground or wherever they previously were. They were moving towards us in all their rotten, moldy, unnaturally angled glory. Their bones were rattling and crinkling as they made their way towards us. The clicking of their bones and the wet squelches of rotten flesh echoed in our ears, spurring us on as we ran for our lives. All that sick combination of sight and sound actually made me barf. The noises seemed to be getting closer and closer, making me panic even more. We were at the last leg of our trip to the hidden door. We had almost made it out when tragedy struck. James stumbled on something and came crashing down. He let out a shriek in terror. I abruptly stopped as soon as I realized. Turning around, I rushed towards him to help him get up. He was already trying to stand up again, but was unable to. He had at least twisted his foot in the fall. I reached out for him, terrified as the things were getting closer. And just as I was about to take his hand to make him stand up, he was all but ripped away from the spot. It seemed that a strong gust of wind was blowing him away from me, except there was no wind around. Something was pulling him in the opposite direction, away from me. And that something did not include the vile, rotten bodies, because they were still coming towards me. I tried to take detours and dodge the zombie-ish creatures to get to James, who was still thrashing around and struggling like a man possessed. Soon he was shouting and screaming in utter agony. I was so shocked, and even more so when his ear-piercing cries started to turn into whimpers and sobs. His body started convulsing. It started bending right in front of my eyes, in shapes I didn't even know were possible for a human to bend into. I felt as angry as I felt afraid. I could do nothing but stare in helplessness no matter how much I tried. I couldn't reach him without going through the creatures and getting myself killed. I still tried a last-minute effort to get to him, to help him, and then suddenly a figure materialized from thin air in front of me, holding me back. It was a relatively older man dressed in a suit, a completely drenched suit with pitch-black eyes staring angrily at me. He had a striking resemblance to the dead owner. I looked over and saw that those horrid creatures were not after me anymore. I was relieved to see that, but the next thing I saw sucked all the relief out of me. James's body was being torn apart, and a shadowy figure was standing beside the spectacle, grinning in glee. I tried to get to him, but the old man in the suit kept blocking my path, screaming at me to get out. He won't let me get any closer. I suddenly remembered my gun. I pulled it out and fired at the old man, but the bullets did nothing to him. They passed right through. I dropped the gun in fear and started backing up. The old man kept yelling at me to get out and that he would hold off the others. I stumbled back and ran towards the door once again. This time there were no distractions, and I was soon out of the boiler room. I took one last look behind. The mutilated body of my childhood friend was the last thing I saw before closing and locking the vault doors behind me. I left the job after that, and to think I would have still been working that job to this day if it wasn't for us having to check that cursed boiler room. And James would have still been alive. I still hold James in my memories, and that night in my nightmares.